And it is my great pleasure to invite to the stage Fadi Saleh.
So just let me know when to start. I should start? Okay, perfect. Yes, so my name is Fadi Saleh. It's great to be here. I am currently a PhD student at the University of Göttingen in Germany. I'm from Syria, and I've worked over the last few years for multiple and different LGBT rights organizations across the Middle East and North Africa. And the title of my talk today is, I will offer some reflections on migration, humanitarianism, and the question of queer refugees. And it was relating to the plenary session today morning. In a lot of our work, like humanitarian activist communities and organizations tend to highlight, or we work a lot on highlighting the violence that queer refugees, for example, regularly face either in their home countries, transit countries, or in the countries of asylum. But in the hype around and the work being done with queer refugees nowadays, however, I would like to highlight a different set of problems that is often not spoken of in terms of or as violence. And here I'm speaking of the ways in which many humanitarians and activists, individuals and organizations, sometimes reproduce violent and oppressive power dynamics in their work that they do with queer refugees, while constantly employing the language of humanitarianism to justify their being outside of power dynamics and these power constellations. So much like I'm gay, I've experienced discrimination, so I really can't be discriminating against others. Nowadays, we notice a rise of the discourse of, I'm a humanitarian, so I can't be possibly doing anything wrong or sometimes harming the very populations I claim or I'm trying to protect. So in this talk, I shall focus on more specifically, the recent global attention accorded to Syrian queer refugees, mostly because it's the context I know the most. From there, to just draw some general implications maybe for the larger context of humanitarian work with queer refugees. First, it is still astounding to me that, yet again, a certain population of queer refugees and migrants, in this case Syrian queer refugees, has taken central stage, sadly to the detriment of many other LGBTIQ groups in the Middle East and North African region and across the globe. So for example, if we take a quick look at the extremely difficult situation of LGBTIQ populations in Egypt, we can see how deadly the problem of who gets more, Western media and humanitarian attention has become. So frequently, many Egyptian gay men and trans women are randomly arrested across the country, and this has been going on for a long time. But there's almost no attention paid globally to the plights of the affected persons. And here I would like to argue that the way a certain group becomes instrumentalized or hyped has unfortunately less to do with whether this group is really affected or is more affected than the others, and it has more to do with how lots of NGOs or institutions or organizations deem more worthy of representation, or in other words, sometimes just more profitable or more trendy. And just to avoid any ignorant or intentional misunderstanding of what I'm saying, I'm not arguing that we should not care or should care less about Syrian LGBTIQ refugees, but we must find more effective ways of equally addressing various affected queer populations or queer refugee populations across the globe. The other thing I wanted to mention, or the second thing, this Western mostly hyper-focus on Syrian queer refugees, does not only lead to the complete disappearance of other queer populations from the scene of representation, but also exposes another structural problem, which is non-Western queers, or non-Western queer refugees in that sense, matter or become worthy of representation, and mostly when they die. So mostly when there's some death or some near-death experience, there seems to be a lot of humanitarian attention intervention accorded to this population. And in that sense, if you look historically over the last 20 years in the MENA region, for example, and first it was the Egyptians in 2001, then emerged the Iranians, then came the Iraqis. I mean, it's quite interesting. And now all of a sudden Syrians, and I'd like to insist that Syrian LGBTIQ refugees between 2011 and 2014 were really outside of the whole global LGBTIQ scene. So it was only after the first person was thrown off of the highest building by ISIS that there was some attention and everybody all of a sudden knew that there were LGBTIQ populations, and that tends to become a problem. And it's sad that many Middle Eastern and North African LGBTIQ persons first signify, become subjects, mean something, or worthy of representation, global attention, and humanitarian intervention first at the moment of death. Another point in representations is the following. I think we've all become familiar with this rather problematic. This is how an Iraqi or Syrian LGBTIQ refugee looks like headlines. I'm sure we all know how that. So apart from how sensational, reductive, and flat out patronizing some of these narratives are, there's an old but persistent danger in them. When mostly gay cis men with access to many privileges are constantly represented as this is how a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer refugee looks like, then we do actually have a major problem. And when people say, you know what I mean, I'm like, no, I really don't know how you could be all of these possibly at the same time. So not only does one become completely complicit in the violence of erasing other voices of the less desirable or less cool refugees, I guess, including other gay cis men even, but also denies these people the opportunity to voice out their concerns, tell their stories, and partake in the shaping of queer refugee politics. And last but not least, ever wondered where LGBTIQ asylum seekers, for example, go when lots of white Western journalists breach all ethical codes of conduct when interviewing or writing about them? Ever wondered where they go to voice out their opinions, what they actually think of what is happening, or wish to critique huge institutions like the UNHCR or other institutions, journalists and researchers and people? Exactly, almost nowhere, or more accurately, almost only to one another. Given that the unquestioned power dynamics between asylum seekers and asylum institutions is way too big, fear becomes every refugee's best censorship tool or self-censorship tool for who would dare critique the very institutions that hold so much power over one's future. The number of times many queer refugees and asylum seekers preferred to keep quiet and silent about how often and violently the UNHCR, other humanitarian activist institutions, or journalists have failed them, jeopardized their safety and privacy, or caused more harm than good are too many to talk about in these short 8 minutes. What we strongly need are functional systems of accountability, ones that allow us to hold us or ourselves or humanitarian activist institutions and individuals accountable when we or they mess up. Systems that give the space and actively invest in making persons feel safe enough to speak their minds and not fear retaliation from the very institutions that claim to protect them, to critique and not be called ungrateful, to reshape the way things are done without them being constantly victimized and relegated to the passive side of queer politics. Thank you so much.